Hey students, just got done with class and I thought I would leave a short video set of notes on some of the specific things from the custom house that we weren't able to get to specific passages in class today. While it's still fresh in my mind, I thought I would present these to you. Might be helpful for your preparation for the midterm. But I would start with this passage. We didn't get a chance to go at it in class. I was describing about how you'll see the image on the screen where Hawthorne had wanted his, well, this is the actual language about the stenciling. He says, this is on page 465, 466 in your text, and he basically is saying this work, the distraction of the commerce going on below him, was a humbling experience. On page 465, he says, "It is a good lesson, though it may often be a hard one, for a man who has dreamed of literary fame and of making for himself a rank among the world's dignitaries by such means, to step aside out of the narrow circle in which his claims are recognized, and to find how utterly devoid of significance beyond that circle is all that he achieves and all he aims at." So he has this humbling experience. He thinks he's a great artist, but he's working in a custom house. And further on bottom page 465 and top of page 466, "No longer seeking nor caring that my name should be blazoned abroad on title pages, I smiled to think that it had now another kind of vogue. The custom house marker imprinted it with a stencil and black paint on pepper bags, and baskets of annatto, and cigar boxes, and bales of all kinds of dutiable merchandise, in testimony that these commodities had paid the impost and gone regularly through the office. Borne on such queer vehicle of fame, a knowledge of my existence, so far as a name conveys it, was carried where it had never been before, and I hope never go again." But the past was not dead. Okay, so we pause there and say that what he's saying here is that his name, instead of being on these important works of literature like he thought would happen, is on all these commodities. And from a romantic standpoint, that's bad. You don't want to be associated with all this materialism. But he says the past was not dead. In the second, once in a great while, the thoughts had seemed so vital and so active, yet had been put to rest so quietly, revived again. And we'll talk about this with Thoreau and others, that this notion of the past, the imagination, this is a very romantic idea, a Wordsworthian notion of the smoldering ember that just needs a breath of life, of oxygen to flame up again. And so his imagination is still there. It may be buried around all these boxes of tobacco and other commodities, but if he can just get his imagination to surface, this great story, the Scarlet Letter, may come out. So he says the past was not dead. Once in a great while, the thoughts that had seemed so vital and so active, yet had been put to rest so quietly, revived again. One of the most remarkable occasions when the habit of bygone days awoke in me, when he was a writer, was that which brings it within the law of literary propriety to offer the public the sketch which I am now writing. In the second story of the custom house there is a large room in which the brick workroom naked rafters have never been covered with paneling and plaster. And here's where he creates this elaborate sort of idea. Whoops. Going up to the second floor of the custom house, he discovers the material left there by surveyor Pugh. And so Jonathan Pugh is in exactly the same position as Hawthorne, but during the Puritan times, the times of his ancestor. He was surveyor in the same custom house. And so you see how there's this connection between the two. And Pugh considered himself a minor historian, and he kept all these papers. This is what Hawthorne tells us. And it's a very elaborate sort of conceit or construction to create this guise of a found history. Well, the only found history is the history that Hawthorne has in his own imagination. Although a lot of this is based on the actual facts and history of what happened in Salem at the time. And like Hawthorne, Pugh, we're told, was drawn to the imaginative analysis of the past over his work. He was a kind of a local antiquarian, and who should have been downstairs working on the custom house, but he was drawn inexorably up to the second floor to create these materials. And so he says, Hawthorne writes, but the object of the most, he goes through this packet of materials that is left by Pugh, this sort of calling from the past, but again, it's a calling from his own imagination to the past. He says that he reads through these papers, he finds out who this custom agent Pugh is, and He says, I contemplate depositing this bundle of materials with the Essex Historical Society. And as I said, if you go to Salem now, there's this huge maritime museum called the Peabody Essex Museum. And Peabody is the family that Hawthorne married into. So it's a real organization that exists. This is made up material that he says he found on in the second floor of the Custom House, but as we talked about in class, he really found it in his upper stories of his imagination, and it lends this air of reality and authority to this romantic story. And he says, but the object that most drew my attention in Mysterious Package was a certain affair of fine red cloth, much worn and faded. There were traces about it of gold embroidery, and here we have the scarlet letter itself, which if you read the book is just a very potent symbol in and of itself. It's supposed to symbolize adultery, but throughout the story it takes on different shades of meaning. And he says, certainly there was some deep meaning in it, in this cloth letter A that he finds, most worthy of interpretation, and which, as it were, streamed forth from the mystic symbol, subtly communicating itself to my sensibilities, but evading the analysis of my mind. And he puts it to his breast, he says, I experienced a sensation not altogether physical, yet almost so, as if a burning heat, as if a letter were not of red cloth, but of red hot iron. I shuddered and involuntarily let it fall to the floor. So think about this. It's such an elaborate metaphor. Hawthorne is connecting to Pew, and he connects Pew, like Hawthorne, to his ancestors. And it's basically a fictional reality within within fiction. It's a fictional reality within fiction based on real events. It's a fictional reality within fiction based on real events, okay? And so he says, in this packet with this letter is all this history of the scarlet letter that Surveyor Pew had left behind. So Hawthorne is doing this elaborate sort of construction where he says, I didn't actually write this story. I pieced it together from what was left behind by this person who was really there. And we might think about why Hawthorne would want to construct such a frame narrative or device in order to set the story of the scarlet letter. It's an interesting technique. But I want to say this a little bit more forcefully about what this has to do with the romantic imagination. Further on, after we get this elaborate conceit, this setup of going back in time and going back to the past by going up to the second floor of the Custom House, getting above the material goods, going up into the imagination of the artist himself, we have this sort of manifesto that Hawthorne writes about how one, as a romantic artist, accesses those elements. Same sort of elements that Emerson was talking about with the ripples in the stream and the transparent eyeballs and all that sort of stuff. You can go into nature, but you can also find truth by going into your imagination. And he says, he describes this scene, he says he goes into his study at night, and he sat in the deserted parlor of the old manse, lighted only by the glimmering coal fire and moon striving, this is page 470 in your text, 470, 471, to picture forth these imaginary scenes. So it's late at night in his study, he's looking into the fireplace, which the next day might flow out on the brightening page of many-hued description. He's got this sort of very dramatic scene, the moonlight filtering in through the windows. He's looking at the fire. He's looking for inspiration. He's really looking to his imagination. He's really looking to get to, in this metaphor, the second floor of his thought process. And he says, this is a medium most suitable for a romance writer to get acquainted with his elusive guests. So he's trying to find these people, and he keeps using this image of the extinguished lamp, the light that's going out, the burning ember, but it can be revived if somehow you, like Emerson says, become the transparent eyeball. Let nature flow through you, let imagination flow through you, let the truth flow through you, and the romantic writer will be inspired, and those words will kind of pour out on the page. And here's how he describes it. He says, thus, therefore, the floor of our familiar room has become a neutral territory where he's writing, somewhere between the real world and fairyland, where the actual and the imaginary may meet, and each imbue itself with the nature of the other. That's an important idea that we didn't get to in class. The actual and the imaginary. The actual history of Salem. The actual history of Hawthorne's ancestors. The actual history of what happened during the witch trials. The actual history of what would have happened to a character like Hester Prynne. And the imaginary, what he does to make it up in his mind and put it in the novel. Even though Hester Prynne never existed, her story speaks to us because it's true. It's a true story because it captures some sort of element of the reality of the world, of what it must have been like for the Puritan times and what it must be like to read that story in our contemporary times. And I think the Scarlet Letter still reads to us, still has resonance with us in this modern era. And so this idea of combining the actual and the imaginary is the whole conceit of the Custom House. And I love this description, and I'll just leave you with this as sort of the romantic imagination. I think some of you are budding writers. You might want to etch this little saying off in a postcard and affix it to your mirror in your study where you go to write at night. He says, with this idea of combining the actual and the imaginary, which he symbolically does by going up to the second floor of the Custom House, the somewhat dim coal fire has an essential influence in producing the effect which I would describe, looking into the fire. It throws its unobtrusive tinge throughout the room, with faint ruddiness upon the walls and ceiling, and a reflected gleam from the polish of the furniture. This warmer light mingles itself with the cold spirituality of the moonbeams, and communicates, as it were, a heart and sensibilities of human tenderness to the forms which fancy summons up, which your imagination summons up, which fancy summons up. It converts them from snow images into men and women. Glancing at the looking-glass, we behold, deep within its haunted verge, the smoldering glow of the half-extinguished anthracite. Half-extinguished. It's not completely out. It just needs to be revived, right? The half-extinguished anthracite, the white moonbeams on the floor, and the repetition of all the gleam and shadow of the picture, with one remove farther from the actual and nearer the imaginative. See what he's doing there? Again, the metaphor going up to the second floor of the Custom House. One remove from the actual. One remove farther from the actual events that took place, and nearer to the imaginative. Then, at such an hour, and with this scene before him, if a man, sitting all alone, cannot dream strange things and make them look like truth, he need never try to write romances. That's the essence of the romantic artist, as Hawthorne would have us understand it. Thanks for listening. See you after we're done with the midterm exam and after break.